The serpent in the Garden of Eden is one of those characters that, despite their inherent wickedness, we cannot help but be fascinated by or curious of. Traditional believers may be quick to dismiss any such reflection pertaining to the serpent, but others can't help but indulge in the exploration of such an entity, one who, as far as the biblical account is concerned, incited the ultimate downfall of man. Described in Genesis as the creature that convinced Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, the serpent has long been associated with evil and is linked to Satan in later theological interpretations. Over time, it became a universal symbol of sin and treachery, shaping perceptions of serpents in many religious or cultural narratives. But beyond this symbolic role, the serpent's punishment in Genesis 3:14, where it is condemned to crawl on its belly, raises intriguing questions. Ultimately, it suggests that before its curse, the serpent may have had a different form, perhaps one who stood upright, or even had additional limbs. It may have possessed a less conventional locomotion that we're used to seeing, perhaps even sporting additional appendages, such as legs or even wings, enabling the creature to fly. Going by the biblical illustration of the snake, we might even say that the snake was far more intelligent than any snake we know of today, being able to not only talk, but also strategize. In today's episode, we'll be dissecting the curse that God placed upon the serpent, seeking to understand what this might have meant within the context of ancient readers. Furthermore, we'll also explore the more New Age ideas that the serpent's physiology must have changed according to this narrative, as well as underpinning the concepts that lead some believers to consider the serpent and snakes in a whole new light altogether. The biblical account tells us from the onset of chapter 3 that the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals that the Lord God had made, before subsequently demonstrating its ability to talk. Here we see the serpent telling Eve that she would not die if she ate the fruit from the forbidden tree of knowledge, and that if she and Adam did eat, then they would become like God himself, knowing good and evil. After Eve is convinced by the serpent, which sees her eat the fruit with her husband Adam, both man and woman find themselves aware of their nakedness and realize that their innocence is now lost. God comes to realize this, and after putting two and two together, deduces that they must have done exactly that which he told them not to. When he learns that the serpent was the catalyst for this betrayal, he immediately punishes the snake with a curse, saying unto the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life." If we offset this against today's reptiles, we can see that the description aligns with our expectation of the average serpent. Snakes, as far as we can observe, do indeed crawl on their bellies, and this is the only form of locomotion that they are believed to possess. Therefore, it does beg the question, for those who take the narrative literally, how did the serpent move before this incident? Unfortunately, the Bible does not present us with any details as to how the snake's physiology was changed. In fact, the only detail the Bible gives us in regards to the snake's transformation is that it loses its previous appetite and diet and is bestowed with consuming something far less nutritious: dust. This, we know, is not congruent with the natural diet of serpents. Indeed, they are not known to eat dust, but rather maintain a more varied taste for warm-blooded prey, as well as insects, amphibians, and even other reptiles. We'll dive into the reasoning behind this association to dust a little later, but for now, allow us to consider the physical features of this pre-fall serpent, and how it may have been theorized to move before it was cursed to crawl on its belly. According to author James H. Charlesworth in his book The Good and Evil Serpent, the serpent is described as being deprived of having legs and feet by God, allowing for the idea that before being cursed by God, it may have either scuttled low to the ground, akin to a sausage dog, or it may have had longer legs, more akin to a human, allowing it to walk and stand upright. Such imagery might remind us of Near Eastern iconography found in Egyptian mythology, specifically the deity Nehebkor, a primordial snake that possessed the legs and feet of a human. However, one may be hesitant to accept this as evidence that a precursed serpent would have had legs, because as we know from the Egyptian pantheon, many gods appeared with this zoomorphic imagery, sporting amalgamations of several bestial characteristics that were one part human and one part animal. The MacArthur Study Bible, edited by evangelical preacher John F. MacArthur, indulges such a theory, telling us that the serpent probably had legs before this curse, though the study does not elaborate any further as to what these legs may have looked like, how many there might have been, nor to what motion the snake was afforded as a result of these additional limbs. Naturally, with the biblical source material being so vague, with the serpent's previous form before the curse, it makes sense why so many commentators are hesitant to hazard any assumption as to how the serpent may have once moved. What's interesting though is that these very commentators and scholars do, for the most part, acknowledge that there was a change or transformation to the snake's characteristics. It's just not possible to ascertain exactly what this might have looked like. Another interesting tidbit from the Egyptian pyramid texts, those which highlight the funerary rites conducted on behalf of the deceased pharaoh to ensure his journey into the afterlife was a success, reveal to us many spells and incantations that the pharaoh was encouraged to use in order to defend himself on his way to the field of reeds, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of heaven. Among the hundreds of spells are several specifically designed to repel snakes that are implied to otherwise impede on the pharaoh's journey. These very spells are eerily similar to the biblical God's curse in Genesis, where the snake is made to lie down, fall over, or slither with its head on the ground. Now, these might very well be commands to disable or silence the snake into submission, but it is interesting that the commands don't deviate that tremendously from how we'd expect the snake to present itself, lying down, its head on the ground, etc. Once more though, such an idea with such Egyptopian influence can be dismissed, especially if we consider that snakes, as well as scorpions, were once regarded as highly deadly creatures that man could encounter, even spawning several mythological tales where the gods themselves could be felled by such creatures. Therefore, it's completely plausible that there would be many spells and incantations to help ward off snakes in one's journey into the afterlife. After all, snakes had already cemented themselves as man's enemy in his mortal life. Why would they be any different in his spiritual one? Other characteristics associated with the snake before it was cursed suggest that the snake was highly intelligent, perhaps even smarter than humans, given that it was able to deceive them. The Genesis account tells us explicitly that the serpent was more crafty than all the beasts of the field, giving us the impression that the serpent was not only more inclined to wickedness than the other animals, but that it was also a creature that man ought to have kept his eye on. Furthermore, it would be remiss not to comment on the fact that the serpent is able to speak. Some suggest that this was because Satan had entered into the serpent, or had taken the guise of the serpent in order to corrupt Adam and Eve. But you'll also notice that when the serpent approaches Eve, whether as Satan or not, Eve is not surprised to behold a talking animal, and rather nonchalantly proceeds to converse with it. This leaves us with the impression that Eve was used to seeing this particular animal talk, and may very well have spoken with serpents as easily as she might have spoken with Adam. Perhaps this is what made the serpent so crafty, according to the biblical narrative, that it was so intelligent it had mastered human speech. Now, we can't omit the fact that the biblical account specifies that the serpent would eat dust all the days of its life, when we know snakes don't actually eat dust. To explain this, some believers reconcile that whilst the snake's form might have actually been transformed by God, the consumption of dust is merely symbolic. This is believed by some to be a literary effect to signify shame, something that's echoed later in the Bible such as in Psalms 72:9, where we are told that the enemies of God will lick dust, or in Micah 7:17, where the enemies of God are said to lick the dust like a serpent. Essentially, the eating of dust isn't meant to be taken literally, but rather as a means to further deplore and diminish the serpent, a metaphor of the creature's shame and defeat. Another common belief, one which dictates that much of the Old Testament ought to be taken metaphorically, instead of literally, suggests that cursing the snake was to remind man of Satan, and how man, or at least his progenitor Adam, was susceptible to sin. By this logic, Satan, as the serpent, was not to be underestimated, and therefore snakes became a potent reminder of the seriousness of not only Satan's deception, but also the fall itself, and the associated consequences that humanity would come to endure forever after. In the subsequent verse of Genesis 3:15, God continues his curse of the serpent, saying, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Here we can unpick even more symbolism behind the serpent's and Satan's punishment, that the snake will always be beneath man, both physically and spiritually. And whilst man has the power to crush the snake's head, the snake might only nip at the man's heel. Whilst an actual snake can inject lethal venom into their bites, or crush a man to death with its coils, the intention of the biblical text is to present man above the serpent, and effectively serve as a metaphor for man overcoming Satan and wickedness in general. With these ideas in mind, what the serpent looked like before it was cursed, and how it moved, are not necessarily a concern to believers, but rather the shift in hierarchy is the biggest takeaway, where snakes were once equal to the other animals and the other beasts of the field, but were then subsequently relegated beneath man as a result of the serpent's deception. It should be noted that there do exist two schools of thought in regards to the serpent's deceitfulness. On the one hand, there are those who believe that the serpent was an independent being that acted wickedly, with its own interests in mind, kind of in a similar vein to the likes of Lucifer, whilst others believe that Satan had either possessed the serpent and puppeted the animal to do his bidding, or he had taken the form of a serpent and effectively framed snakes as evildoers. Whichever belief one may subscribe to, the result is the same. All snakes are cursed, their physiology and locomotion altered because of the actions of one serpent's choices. Seems pretty harsh, right? And yet it's also quite typical of the biblical God's handiwork. You see, in the same way Adam was cursed to work the ground through painful toil, and Eve was cursed to endure tremendous pain during childbirth, all men and all women that come after them also have to experience the same punishment, even though none of them were even in the Garden of Eden. Much less could they be accused of eating any of the fruit from the trees. To explain this, believers have a variety of options to choose from, including that despite not having sinned in the same way ourselves, we still nonetheless inherit the sin of Adam and Eve, or that man is born physically alive and therefore naturally sinful, but also born spiritually dead, and thus must be born again via spiritual rebirth to attain a new virtuous nature. Ultimately, every human, according to this belief system, is handcuffed to his or her sinful nature by default, courtesy of Adam and Eve's choices. Therefore, the same logic applies to snakes, who also continue to crawl on their bellies and eat dust. Even though you might argue that snakes are just as innocent as any other animal, and probably get more of a bad rap than they deserve. To make matters even more seemingly unfair, at the very least, humanity is given the chance to eradicate this natural inherited sin by accepting Christ. But there is no such reprieve nor amnesty for the snake. Another idea suggests that the serpent in the Garden of Eden willingly offered up its body to Satan to corrupt man with, and in the process willingly condemned all of its own species to a lesser existence, where they couldn't talk, couldn't walk, and would no longer possess the intelligence to rival mankind's. It might also be said that this one serpent was symbolic for all serpents in existence at that time, who, for whatever reason, all hated mankind and wished to see him fall out of God's good graces. If we were to run with this idea that Satan used the snake, it might also be said that Satan chose the snake arbitrarily. Perhaps the snake was the nearest animal to Eve when Satan infiltrated the garden, and so that's the animal he commandeered. It could have therefore been just as easily a bird, a bear, or any number of animals in the Garden of Eden. If this idea is to be believed, we can assume that the serpent had no rational mind, and therefore it had no sense of sin. It was simply acting as Satan commanded, speaking through the animal in an effort to manipulate Eve and goad her into transgressing. God still nonetheless curses the snake anyway, even though we might establish here that the snake was nothing more but an instrument. The snake, by this interpretation, knows nothing of sin, it knows nothing of temptation, and it knows nothing about the tree of knowledge, and the warning God gave against the fruit of this tree. So what's the point in punishing the snake then, I hear you say? Well, again, some commentators point back to the symbolism of such a punishment. Some suggest that the serpent, and subsequent snakes, have no self-conscious. They don't know the greater reality unfolding around them from the scope of humanity, much less does any other animal. And if they once did, then the curse saw to it that this ability, this higher level of consciousness, was removed as part of their transformation. This curse then was no longer about the serpent. The serpent did not remember its life before the curse, and its new degradation to only crawl on its stomach and to eat dust would be, as far as the serpent was concerned, how its life had always been. But mankind would always know, and it would view the serpent as a constant reminder of how they were once deceived, how wicked the power of Satan was, and how they might be deceived again. By some interpretations, in the same way that believers might be reminded of God's promise to never flood the earth again whenever they see a rainbow, on the account that God put a rainbow in the sky to mark his covenant with the earth, believers therefore might feel the same way about snakes, immediately associating the animal with the deception, corruption, and wickedness that had transpired in the garden. Additionally, there are those who might be reminded of humanity's triumph over evil when glancing upon a snake. For the same way the snake was cast down to crawl on its belly, so too can it be interpreted that Satan would suffer the same fate. All in all, the true nature of the serpent before its curse will always remain a mystery, unless we happen to stumble upon an ancient tablet or text somewhere that paints us a more detailed picture. Yet even if this was to happen, many believers would ultimately dismiss such findings, given that they were evidently not important enough to have been described by the original authors of the Genesis narrative. Whether it once had legs, moved upright, or possessed a more majestic form, the serpent became one of the most enduring representations of evil, deception, and spiritual downfall in religious tradition. For believers, it stands as a cautionary figure, reminding them of humanity's vulnerability to temptation and the weight of moral choices. To others, it may have served to install a greater reverence for the animal, who unmistakably does possess the power to maim, injure, and kill. Just as the serpent's fate was forever altered by its role in the fall of man, so too are the lives of those who stray from righteousness. In this way, the story of the serpent transcends the mere speculation about its original form, and may be better off left as a timeless lesson of the power of sin, and the consequences it brings. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed today's video, then please leave a like, as this does trigger the algorithm into recommending more of my content. We're also really close to 1 million subscribers now, so if you want to help push us over the edge, then do smack that subscribe button and consider becoming a channel member. Until next time.